What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Pioneer video, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Amalia combo deck for the Pioneer format. It's a deck that I've enjoyed playing a lot. It kind of gives me a little bit of like memories of playing Yawgmoth in Modern. Obviously they are kind of like more cousins than they are like brother and sister. But, you know, to me anyway, like the general idea, the game plan, the mulligans, things like that, all kind of feel the same to me, so I've kind of gravitated towards playing this deck over something like Lotus Field or like Rakdos, and I've been enjoying it, so I'm going to hope that I can do the deck a little bit of justice in getting you prepared to play the deck or play against it. But before we get too deep into that, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more Pioneer content as well as Modern and longer form content, please consider subscribing to the channel, ring the notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. And if you go into the description down below, I have two links. I have one going to the deck list by Christopher Larson here, who, by the way, was a semifinalist in the Pro Tour and played 7 games in the top 8 against Simon Nielsen, who's been an absolute heater lately. Or I shouldn't say lately, like over a year. But yeah, that was honestly like a really entertaining finals to watch. But, you know, follow that link to this deck list. And then, of course, my Discord server as well if you want to join over there. Talk about Magic, really anything to do with anything about Magic. I absolutely just love playing the game and everything. But with all that way, let's go ahead, take a look at Amalia combo. Now, for those of you who have maybe heard of this deck, see it, don't really understand what's going on, I'll go over kind of like the basics of what you're looking for and what you're trying to do. So the idea is that you get this card, the namesake, Amalia, into play. She has Ward, pay 3 life. So if your opponent targets her with a spell or ability, they have to pay 3 life for the ability or spell is countered. So she's a 2-mana 2/2. And whenever you gain life, Amalia explores. Then destroy all other creatures if its power is exactly 20. You know, a decently powerful ability, but you're going to have to gain a ton of life, and you're going to have to explore a bunch to eventually get her up to 20 power, or play a bunch of pump spells, things like that. Obviously, that's not what this deck is doing. That wouldn't be ideal. That's not why this deck would be very powerful if you had to play a bunch of other things to kind of get it up to 20 power. You know, that kind of dilutes your deck a little bit. So, there's this card from the original Ixalan set, Wildgrowth Walker, which is another 2-mana creature that whenever a creature you control explores, you put a +1/+1 counter on Wildgrowth Walker and you gain 3 life. Previous standard staple from the Golgari decks, and it is going to help Amalia go absolutely nuclear as long as we are able to gain life or explore. So if you have both of these cards in play, as long as you trigger one, you're going to trigger the other, which is then going to trigger the other one, so on, and we're going to explore until we essentially hit 18 spells, depending on, Amalia's like power and toughness, or I guess really just power. So if you already have like a few counters on Amalia, like she's 5/5, you're going to be able to find like 15 spells essentially with Amalia. If you hit lands off of explores, you end up just putting them in your hand while you get to decide if the cards that are on top, the non-creatures or the non-land spells, if they go to the graveyard or if they stay on top. So Amalia and Wildgrowth Walker have a few ways of kind of like triggering this back and forth. And of course, we know, I guess of note before we actually move on, Amalia, the way this combo stops is if Wildgrowth Walker gets destroyed when Amalia decides to destroy all creatures, is the easiest way of doing it. If your opponent gives Wildgrowth Walker indestructible, the game ends in a draw on paper, and I believe on Moto, you just end up losing. So something to keep in mind if you decide to play this deck on Moto, because it has happened a time or two to me. And it's very unfortunate, especially because I believe I would have ended up winning a lot of my matches that ended up happening. So just to know that if you have both these in play and they're triggering back and forth, if your opponent gives Wildgrowth Walker indestructible, the game's over. So what are some ways that we can kind of trigger these events to happen? So if we have both in play, we need to explore or we need to gain life. Well, in this deck list in particular, there's Lunarch Veteran. This is whenever another creature you control enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life. So ideally, a curve in this deck, one of the ways that you can win on turn 3, because this deck is very capable of doing that. You play Lunarch Veteran on turn 1, or you just play Tap Line Pass. You play Amalia on turn 2. Ideally, you play Veteran into Amalia because of the fact that you are going to... You're going to get an Explorer, you're going to have a little bit more of a chance to find, one of your other spells like Court of Calling or, Thoughts. Well, really just Court of Calling at that point. to end up finding a Wild Growth Walker. And then turn 3, you are able to play your third land. You are able to court for exactly 2 as long as your opponent does not kill Lunarch Veteran or Amalia. So you can then go get a Wild Growth Walker. If you do it that way, Amalia can attack that turn and kill your opponent, but you are able to kind of clear the board and you have a lethal threat in play. If you just naturally play the Wild Growth Walker and your opponent cannot interact with the Wild Growth Walker, then the game is absolutely over. You have two Selfless Saviors in this version to kind of like protect your Amalia, because a lot of the times things just don't end up going well for you if your opponent is able to interact multiple times with this combo. So while this is powerful, and we've established that you can essentially make it ends up being like 21 power Amalia, depending on how many triggers you get, it's like 21 or 22 power that you actually get on Amalia. So in a lot of instances, she is going to just win the game in one swing. However, our opponent is interacting with us. Rakdos is a very popular deck in the format. Lotus Field has a little bit of has some answers. Of course, the Izzet deck also has like Auto War and things like that. So what is another way that we can try to win the game when doing this? Well, thankfully with the Wild Growth Walker, we're going to gain 3 life essentially for every time that Amalia is going to explore. So at minimum, if we just hit like 18 spells in a row or keep 18 spells, we do 18 times 3, I believe is 54 with some quick math. So you're going to gain 54 life. You're presumably going to be up to like 70, we'll say. 70 or 71 at the minimum. So you need another way to win the game if your opponent is just constantly going to be able to kind of attack and go after your Amalia. Well, in some decks, there's a Dina in play that can essentially, whenever you gain a life, your opponent loses 1 life. So you're able to kind of set up a turn where you have like Return to the Ranks and you get a bunch of things back. And, you have these Lunarch Veterans, you have these Prosperous Innkeepers, and they're going to end up gaining you life, as 1 life. So you end up draining your opponent for 1 that way. Other decks have decided to go with Aetherflux Reservoir as like their way of winning the game outside of Amalia. So whenever you cast a spell, you gain 1 life for each spell you cast this turn, and then you can pay 50 life, and it deals 50 damage to target creature or player. Obviously, while you're kind of exploring with Amalia, you're looking for a few things. I found that in the early versions of this deck, you'd want to explore, and at least for me personally, you could put a bunch of creatures in the graveyard until you find like a Return to the Ranks, and then you can just Return to the Ranks everything back reasonably, bring everything back. Or you kind of look for Aetherflux Reservoir, you look for Adina. Really, even in those cases, you're probably binning it, so then you can go find Return to the Ranks and kind of bring everything back and try to kill your opponent with 1 big Return to the Ranks. And that's mainly how this deck tries to win the game. Like, that's how the only really ways that it can win in game 1s and even like in the sideboard as well. As you kind of see some other cards that are pretty decent for playing like this mid-rangey type of game plan. And that's kind of this deck's plan B, is being a mid-range deck where you can play like Send Out Scout on turn 1. It's going to help you court or pay the Convoke on your Court of Callings. It's going to kind of fix your draws because you're going to be able to keep some like 1 and 2 lane hands, playing a Scout, and then being able to, draw relevant spells. A lot of your, important spells are 2 mana, so if you can get to that second land or have that second land, then you're able to kind of like freely bin other spells, or of course like end up drawing cards with the Send Out Scout. One main deck Haywire Might, currently blanking on like the matchups this is like good in. Like, obviously there's some pretty good targets for it where we know like Fable the Mirrorbreaker is pretty good. There's Smuggler's Copter out there. Of course, Smuggler's Copter is a little bit dangerous to try to interact with because they can just turn it into a creature and kind of negate like the Haywire Might activation. But this is also a card that can gain life. It can technically sacrifice itself as long as it has a target to actually get rid of a non-creature artifact or a non-creature enchantment. So it can trigger your Amalia, which then can trigger Wild Growth Walker, or you can just essentially get an Explorer like on your opponent's end step with Amalia as well with a Haywire Might. Already went over Lunarch Veteran, Selfless Savior, sacrifice to give another creature you control indestructible. Big thing to actually protect Amalia because there isn't a lot of exile-based removal in the format. So just giving it indestructible is usually going to be good in like 95% of scenarios. You have Fauna Shaman, which is kind of a newer addition to this deck. And an addition that I personally like. I'm playing at least 1 copy in my deck just because I like to be a little bit more of a mid-range deck. But Fauna Shaman is a pay green, discard a creature card. search your library for a creature, reveal it, put it to your hand, then shuffle. So 2-mana 2/2 can let you turn like some of these other cards, like maybe redundant Cenote Scouts into Amalias, turn Wild Growth Walkers. Can even go get like Extraction Specialist, Sentinel, and Nameless City, Skyclave Apparition as some of like your one-of targets, even Haywire Might as well, for those situations where you need to interact a little bit before you're actually able to kind of go off and kill your opponent. Extraction Specialist being very good because of the fact that if you already have like a Lunarch Veteran or a Prosperous Innkeeper and a Wild Growth Walker into play, you're going to be able to play Extraction Specialist, get back in Amalia, boom, trigger everything, blow everything up. Now Amalia can attack because the Extraction Specialist is not on the battlefield. Super cool. Like a neat interaction, I think. Also, if you're, just able to keep the Extraction Specialist around and like block with it, whatever, you unlock the Amalia, plus you're going to get an Explore trigger from this card as well. So that's, essentially the creature package. You are a creature combo deck. You have a few toolboxy type slots. I know that I'm playing like Deep Root Bat or whatever the heck it is that like thought seizes your opponent, takes a spell as long as it's in play. Playing like 4 Sentinel, the Nameless City. Actually, maybe 3 or 4 Sentinel, the Nameless City. Again, I kind of appreciate these like more mid-rangey takes because you can play this game where you play like Sentinel of the Nameless City and the Wild Growth Walkers, and you're able to like make these map tokens. You're able to explore. You're going to grow Wild Growth Walker, ideally grow Sentinel and Nameless City as well. Gain some life, swing those racing situations kind of in your favor because you're just going to have bigger creatures and you're going to be gaining life on top of it too, and getting some card selection as well with the map tokens by either drawing additional lands, eventually hitting some of your other like utility lands, or just, again, beefing up these cards and, hitting other Court of Callings, Return to the Ranks, and things like that. Speaking of, this is the first deck that has not been playing for Collected Company, and even though it's like a little bit worse because you have 3 hits, I know some decks were playing like 1 or 2 that were in the 3 cost range, and them actually playing less Return to the Ranks with more with less 3 drops, which you would think that Return to the Ranks would be better if you had 2 cost creatures and whatever. But 2 Collected Company in this list in particular. I like 4 just because Collected Company can put you in some weird situations. Getting to put 2 cards into play, while it's like a very niche scenario that you can find yourself in. I was playing a match against the like 5-color mid-range, whatever, just dumb bring to light stuff, and they had an Elesh Norn in play, which notably stops all your enter the battlefield abilities. So Lunarch Veterans, Prosperous Innkeepers aren't going to trigger. However, the flip side of Lunarch Veteran in Luminous Phantom will trigger if a creature leaves the battlefield. So there was actually a game where if my opponent didn't have the dang exile, the 1 exile like removal spell they have in Leyline Binding, I Collected Companied into 2 Amalias and got to keep one of them, and then Legend Rule the other one away. Creature dying, gaining life, and then just be able to go up the combo chain and win the game, and actually get rid of the Elesh Norn. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. But again, like still almost one of the best stories that I have playing this deck. So 2 Collected Company, to me kind of weird, but they got the semifinals of a Pro Tour, and I 3-2 a league, so we're just not the same. 4 Court of Calling and 4 Return to the Ranks. So Return to the Ranks is probably your one of your most explosive ones behind Collected Company. Court of Calling is going to absolutely get you what you want to get for what you can pay for, while Return to the Ranks is going to be able to just fully reset your combo. So Return to the Ranks, X equals 3. You're able to get a Veteran, a Prosperous Innkeeper, or one of those 2, and then Amalia and Wild Growth Walker. Beyond that, like a lot of the times too, especially if you're playing like Dina in your deck, you are getting back a ton of like Lunarch Veterans and Prosperous Innkeepers, and then like a Dina, maybe you're getting like an Amalia or whatever to kind of get a little bit of card advantage going. You're not going infinite, but you are going to make a pretty decent sized creature, and you're going to drain your opponent for a ton of life, so that these random like 1/1s and potentially like 2/2s and things like that are going to be able to kind of like close out the game after you've just blown up the board with Amalia. So Return to the Ranks definitely, to me, is at least one of the more swingy cards. I don't think I like 4 copies of this card anymore. I definitely like 4 Collected Company, and I've been playing with 2 Return to the Ranks. It just, to me, felt better, especially with going into a more creature combo-y build rather than like this Aetherflux Reservoir build. One Thoughtseize, I'm assuming that this was probably just more of like a meta game call. Like, I don't think I would play like a single Thoughtseize in the main board, but that's just me. So that's essentially like kind of like the synergies and stuff like around like the creatures and like the spells that you're trying to kind of get in play to end up doing things with. Some things to note and kind of some cool interactions. If you don't necessarily have the combo, but you want to kind of like trigger Amalia a bunch to kind of start digging for that combo, there is times where I've played, you know, if I have like 1 or 2 Lunarch Veterans or like Prosperous Innkeeper, like a few ways where I'm going to gain a few life for each creature I play, and I'm sitting with a Quarter Calling in hand. You know, just playing, you know, one of your creatures, play like a Scout. I lean towards playing like Gilded Goose and things like that. You play the Goose, you gain, you know, 2 or 3 life. But with those triggers on the stack, you end up courting for 2 and going to get an Amalia, which then is going to gain you more life, which means that if you gain 3 life from the Goose, you're going to gain 6 life total after the Amalia, which means you're going to get 6 Explore triggers, which is probably a good way to end up finding either Wild Growth Walker or Extraction Specialist to go get back a Wild Growth Walker, another Court of Calling to go find Wild, you know, so on and so on. Just all roads leading to Rome in kind of like those situations, and those are the kind of things you want to look out for. You want to be able to best utilize your collected companies and your Quarter Callings. Unlike Yawgmoth, where you can just kind of combo and not need the combo step, or use the combat step, not the combo step. Not using the combat step in Yawgmoth, but being able to kind of do it on your opponent's turn, do it on your turn while they're tapped out, you know, what have you, any of those situations. Amalia, for the most part, needs to win through the combat step. So being able to keep that in mind while you're setting up your combo, just being able to kind of do these tricks, like attacking with an Amalia when you don't have, you know, 20 power or whatever, and kind of forcing your opponent to make a decision, especially like if you have Dina in play too. It's essentially a second Amalia because you're able to kind of attack, you know, do your thing. If you can court and get a Wild Growth Walker, get Amalia super close. If your opponent blocks Amalia before she would go and destroy all creatures, you sacrifice it to the Dina. You end up, you know, draining your opponent a bunch while you're kind of comboing as well. And then you can sacrifice the Amalia to the Dina if it's unblocked to then kill your opponent that way and just get in tons of damage. Just, again, some things that you absolutely want to keep in mind. This is a deck that doesn't really fold to Graveyard Hate. I know there's 4 Return to the Ranks in this deck in particular. Again, I like to play 2 copies of this card. But it's not a deck that really folds to Graveyard Hate and a bunch of removal spells because it can play this kind of grindy mid-range game plan where you're just kind of like, your opponent's not going to want to kill Lunarch Veterans and Prosperous Innkeepers. More than likely. They're going to want to save the removal spells for the Amalias, for the Wild Growth Walkers, and things like that. So if you're able to kind of get some value from Amalia and then set up, you know, like Return to the Ranks, get a bunch of stuff back, like you're going to outgrind, you know, these mid-range decks. Like getting attacked by like Vein Rippers and stuff, if you're not able to assemble the combo and execute it at any point, is going to be a little rough. But once you kind of get up to, you know, 80, 90, 100 life with this deck, in most cases, a lot of decks are going to struggle to kill you, which is going to give you plenty of time to kind of reset up either doing the combo again to then eventually kill your opponent, or just setting up big Return to the Ranks to bring them all back, kill your opponent, find Aetherflux Reservoir, and 50 your opponent to the dome. The lands in this deck, you are definitely prioritizing a lot of like good mana fixing with not very many utility lands. The utility lands in particular being Boseiju, because I believe any green deck, Boseiju is just essentially at least a one of staple for the deck. You have cards like Scattergroves, which is the green-white cycle land that lets you draw a card for 2 mana. You have Takenuma, which is going to mill 3 cards to get a creature or planeswalker back from your graveyard to your hand. It does come up quite a bit. I mean, the fact that you have like Amalia in your deck and you have all these different ways of getting it. That some of these cards, I mean, these cards are going to cost, you know, 1 less to actually activate, which is pretty relevant in a deck that kind of wants to use as much of its mana as possible to, you know, go dig for its, you know, for a piece and then play another one, you know, and kind of set up that turn where they get to gain a ton of life, blow up the board, and set up their draw to be very explosive for the next turn. Aside from that, you know, you have Temple Gardens, Razor Ridge Thicket. You have 1 basic Plains where a lot of decks were playing the basic Forest. You have a 3 Overgrown Tomb, 4 mana Confluence, which this card desperately needs a reprint, by the way. You have 2 Godless Shrine, and of course the Besiege, 3 Blooming Marsh. Your mana base is not very painful. In all things considered, you're playing like the 3 Thicket, you're playing the 3 Blooming Marsh. There's other versions that I've seen playing the Concealed Courtyard, which is the white-black fast land, and in favor of playing those over more shock lands. I believe, at least with typical draws and stuff, I think you're gaining enough life to where, shocking a Godless Shrine into play, and then playing another threat, you're going to easily gain that life back over the course of a game to kind of make it free for the most part. You just have to have that initial cost paid up front. The sideboard, I personally like having the sideboard be more of a like toolbox than I do kind of like bringing in other things to kind of stop what other people are doing. That said, that's kind of like the sentiment, I guess, that is here, where you have like Sentinel of the Nameless City, you have Thrun, Breaker of Silence, these decks that are, or these cards that are kind of more of in like that mid-range kind of like wheelhouse, where you're going to want to play these, like Thrun, especially against like control. Can't be countered, can't be the target of non-green spells your opponent controls, and from non-green sources your opponent's control. And as long as your turn has indestructible, so even if your opponent has a way to instant speed Wrath, they're not going to be able to do it. They're going to have to use something like a, well, I guess they can still Wrath anyway, but Thrun is definitely a hard card to beat, especially, late in the game. If you can get your control opponent into kind of like top deck mode, Thrun is kind of like that way to kind of break their back and like really just kind of end the game quickly. You have more Sentinel in the Nameless City. Again, this card just felt awesome when you're playing like that mid-range strategy. Painful Truce, an OG from the Battle for Zendikar set. You can draw X cards, lose X life, where X is the number of mana, or the colors of mana spent to cast a spell, so you can essentially pay 3 mana, draw 3 cards, lose 3 life. Again, I'm assuming this is like being more of like a grindy tool. You have Lauren on the third path. When she enters, destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment, and then you can also get a little bit of card advantage as well. She's legendary, so like Takenuma and Beseiju notably are going to cost just a little bit cheaper, but you're going to be mainly utilizing that destroy target artifact and enchantment. A little unfortunate it's not 2 mana, so you can't get it back with like Return to the Ranks. I believe Extraction Specialist only cares if it's 2 or less too, so a little bit rough there, but it is what it is. Playing 2 copies as well. Archon of Emeria, definitely in for those Lotus Field matchups where your opponent, each player can't cast more than 1 spell, and non-basic lands your opponent's control enter the battlefield tapped. That's going to cost them, a few turns while they're trying to set up, if they're not already set up, and you're able to get your combo going, as well as just also playing a bunch of creatures, turning them sideways, getting in the red zone, and killing your opponent. Knight of Dusk Shadow, your opponents can't gain life. This is obviously a mirror card, and the fact that it has Menace 2 allows you to be aggressive and play early on turn 2. We have 2 more Thoughtseizes on the sideboard. I'm assuming for other combo matchups. I like playing these against Phoenix just to kind of like disrupt them, just even a little bit. Like again, you can still combo on turn 3, even if as long as you have your 3rd land, you can combo on turn 3 with this deck. So I kind of like spending turn 1 to like Thoughtseize. You could even do it like on turn 3 if your opponent is like left up mana. You can kind of force them to use their removal spells or what have you at those times. But I definitely like doing this like on turn 1 and then leading into like a turn 3 combo that way. Tameo Safekeeping, a way to give it permanent, hexproof and indestructible in a turn. You're going to gain some life. You're going to get a trigger from Amalia. You're going to protect it. Things like that. And life is going to be great. You have Selfless Savior, a 3rd one in the sideboard, and 2 Fatal Push, because you still need to interact with some of the other mid-rangey decks. I also like bringing this in against something like, definitely the Mirror, because you want to be able to take out Amalia's, and you also just want to be able to race them as well and make sure that you can combo a lot faster than they can and disrupt them when you need to. So that is the Amalia combo deck for the Pioneer format. Long-winded. There's a lot going on with this deck. I try to do it as best justice as I can. There's currently just a few ways of playing this deck. I prefer Dina over the Aetherflux Reservoir. I just think you open up for a little bit more like creature combo potential, and you have a sacrifice outlet for the Wildgrowth Walker should your opponent try to give you indestructible, so that you can continue to combo. Of course, you grow the Dina as well, and you can also get in big damage with it. So definitely some things to kind of keep an eye out for when playing this deck. There's going to be a lot of things that you run into. The best thing to do is play this deck as much as you can. Definitely get the reps in. Play test against certain matchups that you're going to be worried about. This deck doesn't really fold to removal a bunch. Like, yeah, it sucks if you get your Amalia fatal pushed after you've gone through your combo and everything, but with how these decks are built, you're able to, for the most part, at a very low fail rate, you end up seeing a ton of cards. There's plenty of times where I combo with Amalia and I see 25 to 30 cards every time that I do it. In 25 to 30 cards, you're going to end up getting enough lands. You're going to be able to hit your land drops for the rest of the game. You're going to more than likely get enough fuel for a return to the ranks, or you're going to be able to find another Dina. You're going to be able to find a Quarter Calling Collective Company, whatever. You're going to be able to find something that is going to make life a little bit easier when you try to go for the combo a second time around, and continue to do so, and of course set up again these big turns where you can just drain your opponent out or just hit them with the cannon. So yeah, that's the Amalia combo deck for the Pioneer format. That's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below if there's another Pioneer deck you would like me to break down and go over next. Of course, if you want to play the deck, I have the deck list in the description. Go down there, follow it. MTG Goldfish is definitely a very good resource for players to study formats and things like that. So definitely highly recommend using them to get your deck list and things like that. Also, the link in the description to my Discord server. Feel free to follow that, all that fun stuff. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed. I'll see you all in the next one.